one would see that while we have to apply the same measures, interpreting things in the light of it, interpreting the Bible in the light of itself, interpreting the Bible in the light of the socio-political, historical context, to a large extent, the context is also mentioned in the Bible. The Bible is a very detailed book, especially the Old Testament. You know, the Quran is only about 4/5 the size of the New Testament. And compared with the Old Testament, the New Testament is actually quite small. The Old Testament then is quite detailed. And we can see some of the historical context described in the midst of the instructions that are given within the Bible. So if we were to ask then about God's promise to Abraham, as Dave pointed out, that is mentioned in the Quran as well. God told the people of Israel to go and dwell in the land. But there's nothing in the Quran about telling the people to go in and kill everyone in the land to take it over. Yet, in the Bible, unfortunately, this is how it says. At first, God promises Abraham in Genesis 12 that I'm going to give you all of this land, the land of the Hivites and Perizzites and Canaanites and so on. 10 different peoples are mentioned. So you might be thinking, okay, God must have some major evacuation plan for all of these people because he's going to give that land to Abraham and his descendants. What's going to happen to the people? Well, I don't need to cite you the verse because Dave has very easily and surprisingly written in his book Armageddon that the plan was to destroy and displace those people, all the 10 peoples that are mentioned. Moving on from that, if we think of Moses, to Muslims, Moses in the Quran is a very peaceful prophet. He rescued the people from under the domination of the Pharaoh. It is the people of God being attacked and oppressed by the others. God's prophet comes to rescue them. God's prophet is a peaceful person. He's Moses, respected and beloved by Muslims. Numbers chapter 31, however, details what happens when Moses led the people on the way. They came upon the Moabites, and they entered into war with them. And Moses gave the people this instruction. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones. That's verse number 17 from Numbers 31. And kill every woman who has known man intimately. But all the girls who have not known man intimately, spare for yourselves. Verse number 32. This booty, what was left of the loot which the soldiers had taken, amounted to 675,000 sheep, 72,000 oxen, 61,000 asses, and 32,000 girls who were still virgins. Now, in Sunday school, we were all taught. I went to Sunday school as well. And, we sang these songs, Round and Round the Walls of Jericho. But we were never told the whole story. Well, the whole story can be read in the pages of the Bible. Joshua chapter 6, verses number 21 and 24 tells us what happens after the walls fell. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and oxen, sheep, and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the harlot's house, referring to Rahab, and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her. So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all of her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. Verse number 24, they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So this was the plan. It wasn't to evacuate those people, give them another land, let them go live somewhere else and say, look, God wants this land for his chosen people. It was displace and destroy in the words of Dave. Now, David, of course, is one of the heroes of the Old Testament. And, of course, Sunday school pictures about David and about Goliath. And, I like to make slingshots because we thought, David was so good with his slingshot. It must be a powerful little weapon. Nice to have one. And, we devised a nice little one that was just a little rubber band with a little paper. And we used that to tease the girls in class. But don't tell anybody I said that. Now, of course, again, we weren't told the whole story. David knocked down the giant with the slingshot, but the rest of it, which can be read in the Bible, is that then he went and beheaded Goliath with the sword. But there's more to David than just this. David, we find, wanted to get married to Saul's daughter. Saul was the king. Saul says, okay, if you want to marry my daughter, bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. So David goes out, he and his men, and they slaughter 200 Philistines, and bring back the foreskins, and counted them out to Saul, and said, okay, now give me your daughter. And so Saul gave him his daughter Michal to be his wife. So David, of course, did better. He was apparently not too hesitant at slaughtering. By comparison, if one were to look at the story of David in the Quran, the story of David in the Quran, again, is about a peaceful prophet who recites beautiful tunes, and the birds sing along with him. David is very peaceful. So the Quran gives us a very peaceful image, whereas by comparison, when we look at the same story, the Bible gives us an image of violence. Now, Dave just spoke to us about an incident which is reported about the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, that he saw the wife of his adopted son, and he became attracted to her. That is not in the Quran. So a Muslim may take that story or leave it. Many Muslims think that is a fictitious story. Muslims themselves came up with stories to romanticize the life of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, in part to justify their own lechery sometimes. But the story itself, as Dave recounted it, shows that the Prophet Muhammad did not do anything with that lady until her husband himself divorced her. The usual waiting period was over, so all of the formalities were done, and then the Prophet Muhammad married her, took her as his wife. So everything was up and all decent. In the Bible, on the other hand, we read about David, and of course he's a man close to God. It says that he was a man after God's own heart. David saw the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba, as she herself was taking a bath. Isn't that curious? Bathsheba taking a bath. Anyway. And he became attracted to her, and he sent for her. And he, being the king, of course, she could not refuse. She went to his palace, and she conceived. Now, what was to be done? Because eventually Uriah will come back and find out that his wife got pregnant while he was out in battle. So David sent for Uriah to be brought back in. And David said, okay, go home, take a break and so on, hoping that this man will go home and have intercourse with his wife. And so when he discovers that his wife is pregnant, he will think, that was when I came back home for a vacation. But this man, being faithful to the king and faithful to the country, said, I'm not going to go home. I cannot go home while my comrades are out in the battlefield. I must go back and fight there. So the man went back. But David sent a letter with him, sealed, instructing the general to place this man in the front lines and to all fall back from him so that the enemy will kill him. And this was done. So we have two different images of David. One in the Quran, one in the Bible. In the Quran, he is a peaceful person, singing tunes. In the Bible, he's quite violent. We can see that there are two different books here, and I wish I didn't have to bring this up, but Dave has in a way cornered me into this. Having read his books and thought about what might be appropriate as a response, it seemed to me that this is the way it had to go. And forgive me if I indulge in any excesses here. I'll hear from your questions and so on and your responses. I'll know what I've done right and what I've done wrong. But let's read about Samson. He was another favorite in Sunday school. Samson, strong guy, long hair, and the strength is in his hair. Judges chapter 16 tells us about Samson. Actually, it turns out that Samson is the first suicide killer, and the only one we know of in the scriptures, actually. Judges 16 verse 27 tells us about Samson when he had been blinded by the enemy. There had been many altercations between him and the Philistines. Sometimes he killed many of them. Sometimes they killed his men. At one time he took 300 foxes. He tied their tails together, lit fire to their tails, and sent them roaming into the cornfields, demolishing all of the crops, and of course burning the foxes as well. So where are the animal rights activists? But when Samson was eventually captured by the enemy after Delilah revealed his secret, and he is brought into the festivities to perform for the crowd, this is what Samson did. Judges 16 verse 27. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Verse 28, Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them. the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might so that the house fell on the Lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. So we don't know the total number of those killed, but there were 3,000 just on the roof alone. That means those on the roof alone were more than the people who died in the 9/11 terrorist bombings, which we should all reject and denounce. But we should at least be clear that there is nothing in the Quran that justifies the events of September 11, 2001, but we have something in the Bible which actually celebrates and glorifies a suicide killer, Samson, whom we learned to love in Sunday school.
Why is the New Testament then different? In his article on jihad in the Blackwell Companion to the Quran, the Jewish writer Reuben Firestone explains the situation in which both the Talmud and the New Testament were written. Here we're talking about the context. Now the context here was different. The New Testament and the Talmud were written at a time when Rome dominated, and there was no hope, either from among the Jews or from among the Christians, that somehow a political struggle will result in any victory. So a passive approach was taken. And this is particularly in page number 313 of the Blackwell Companion to the Quran, in which Reuben Firestone has laid out this case. And one can see this to be true. Jesus, according to the New Testament, was the Messiah who was expected to rule on the throne of David. So that the verse that was quoted about this says that God said to him, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." The imagery was that Jesus would sit in a political rule on a throne that was left vacant by David, and that God would have it such that Jesus would be resting his feet on the slain bodies of his enemies. It was to be a political battle, a military confrontation. But when that could not work, the New Testament writers, writing in a milieu in which they dared not be represented as the terrorists of their day, they wrote things like Romans 13 and 1 Peter, in which it is entirely pacifist. You submit yourself to the ruling authority of the day, do not resist. And this is why Jesus is represented in the Gospel of John as saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." So this is a later rewriting. John, the last of the four Gospels, now takes the Messiahship and gives it a different meaning. It's not anymore about sitting on the throne of David in this life, at least not in the first coming, but when he comes back, the book of Revelation tells us what he will do. He will have a major confrontation with his enemy. His tongue itself will be of a sword, and he will slay everyone except the false prophet and the Antichrist, who will be thrown into the fire. Everyone else, according to the book of Revelation, will be slain by Jesus when he comes back and engages the enemy in that major battle. So the battle motif is present in the Old and in the New Testament. Christians are peaceful, but despite the Bible. And some Muslims are violent, but despite the teachings of the Quran. Thank you.